welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. This is the Wednesday, October 9th, 2019 edition of our little weather get-together, show number 295. And tonight is an open mic night. So we're going to be talking about a couple of things going on, not only here in the Carolinas, but across the United States weather-wise. So we hope that you will look forward to seeing that conversation and hearing our conversation. And as always, we'd love to take your questions. If you are watching tonight on our many live streaming options, you got Facebook Live, Periscope, Twitch, YouTube. You can submit your own questions. If you have a question, maybe about the forecast, maybe when the rain's coming, something like that, let us know. Just type your comment or question into the little bar, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the show. And we'll get to as many as possible. So we hope that you will interact with us. And if you're listening on the podcast version, well, unfortunately, you won't have that option to ask us questions. But we also hope that you will download us on the podcast version and give us a like. You can find us on any of those major podcast outlets, and just type in Carolina Weather Group, and there we are. So we're happy to have you joining us tonight. So like I said, this is an open mic night. We have a few topics that we'd like to discuss. And first of all, before we do that, I'm going to bring in some of our panelists, let them say hello to you and kind of give a brief weather update. We're going to go old school like we used to since it's open mic night. So I'm going to bring in, first of all, a good friend of ours who's down in Charleston, South Carolina tonight, Mr. Shay Gibson. Shay, how is things going in Charleston?
Actually, really cool here, Scotty. We've finally broken our summer heat that ended last Friday. And so we've had a succession of a few days of low 80s, and then we had really good weather over the weekend. Boeing Family Day happened, really perfect weather for that. So it was great to bring the family out to see the Dreamlifter and the Dreamliner and all those really cool things. But since then, we've gotten a northerly wind sort of fixed into the area after a cold front went through. Got a little bit of rain, not very much at all. It was just enough to dust the area, but it was still nice to get the ground wet for once after a while. Since Dorian, we really haven't had very much. We'll talk about that on the drought monitor. But yeah, cool temperatures today. We've had a little bit of a north-northeast wedge built in the area. So we're looking at upper 70s to low 80s for tomorrow and the next few days. And things look really good. We're transitioning to fall nicely, where it's cool at night and not very hot in the daytime. The only thing we have to contend with here are mosquitoes, and those are still pretty bad. So with that said, I'll pass it on to the next region, but we're doing pretty good here, and just keeping the northerly wind around for another day or two.
Awesome, Shay. Thank you for that. I think we're all ready for the mosquitoes to go away. I'll send it to Evan Fisher, who is also in Charleston. But Evan, you also monitor the weather in the North Carolina mountains. So how are things there in your neck of the woods of Charleston, and what else have you been watching over the past week?
Well, the heat finally broke probably Friday afternoon in Western North Carolina. So that was a very welcome reprieve. Summer has been seemingly eternal. But we actually did get some rain over the weekend, lots of clouds, the wedge kind of set in. So it's been cool and moist, and it's certainly not a break from the drought conditions that we've been seeing, but it's better than nothing. And the 30-day precipitation totals of less than half an inch, those have been erased, luckily. Over the next few days, we'll kind of see these temperatures continue to moderate, but we'll get to that a little bit later on.
All right, Evan, thank you for that. And let's bring in a familiar face that you've not seen in a while. Peter, how are things going on up in your neck of the woods?
Oh, I want to put the fireplace on. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, it's been pretty chilly up here lately. We've been stuck in the 50s and 60s with the doom and gloom. There hasn't been much sun lately. And as of now, we're dealing with that little coastal feature out in the ocean that's giving us some rain and wind, and parts of the Jersey Shore dealing with some minor to moderate coastal flooding as we speak. But not doing too much damage, though, thank God. It's been pretty quiet around here lately. So we could use a little bit of rain. We're in a drought, and some places are in a moderate drought. So I guess it's a good thing we have some rain and some cloudy weather here. But it looks like the next week or so, we're only going to go up to the 70s, and maybe we'll get some sun by this weekend. So, yeah, it's been just quiet, cloudy, cool, typical fall weather here in the Northeast.
That is, I was checking one of our settings there. That's kind of been the story here in Western North Carolina. Our first, I was telling Peter before the show starts, and I actually had to wear a hoodie this morning, so it was down into the 50s. the first little spout of cold air, and it looks like next week we could get even chillier. Our last panelist here on the panel tonight, we have Mr. Tim Pounds, who is in the North Augusta area of South Carolina. Tim, how's the weather been down in your area?
Well, since I'm kind of the furthest south of everybody, I'm still not convinced that fall is here yet. Most of our temperatures have been kind of in the low 80s, really getting into the mid 80s as well. And for those of us who live out in the rural areas like I do, our dirt roads are still dusty as mess and our cars are still dusty as heck. So we're getting there. We're starting to feel some little cooler temperatures. I appreciate it not being in the 90s, but we'll welcome the 70s and the 60s as they get here soon.
Yeah, definitely a lot of folks happy about the cooler weather, and I think you'll be getting your taste of cool weather coming really, really soon, maybe as early as next week as we watch a cold front. We'll talk about that cold front coming up in just a little bit. But first, a little bit of news here as we start our first topic is Hurricane Dorian. We're about a month out from when Dorian moved across the eastern part of North Carolina and along the coastal areas of South Carolina. Some news coming out this afternoon from FEMA, and FEMA's talking about where it has rejected the assistance to North Carolina. FEMA director sent a letter to Governor Roy Cooper over the past few days talking about they've reviewed the information, but the impact to the businesses and folks who live in eastern North Carolina did not reach the severity or the magnitude that it needed to for designation of assistance. Roy Cooper calls this devastating and disappointing news. There is an appeal process. Right now, North Carolina Emergency Management Director Mike Sprayberry is meeting in Washington, D.C. with North Carolina delegates to see what they can do in this appeal process and see if we can get some things headed to North Carolina, at least on the federal level. The main issue is the threshold. No matter if 1,000 homes or 10 homes are affected, we still know people are affected, but there is a criteria, and that just was not met in eastern North Carolina, at least from FEMA standards, to provide assistance to those folks who were affected by Hurricane Dorian, especially the folks who live on Ocracoke Island. With that, the North Carolina House lawmakers have gotten together over the past few days to determine what kind of help the state can send out to the Outer Banks and Ocracoke Island. The island school, there's only one school on Ocracoke. It's a K through 12 school. And that school was completely damaged from water and wind. So the students just went back on Monday, 4 weeks after Hurricane Dorian affected the area. They are working on the school, but right now they're in a new location, a new building, so classes can begin again. The state has voted and has elected to forgive the county up to 20 school days missed from Hurricane Dorian, and also some good news that the school personnel, teachers and folks like that who work in the school will be paid for those 20 days. So that way there's not a financial strain on those individuals. So North Carolina lawmakers obviously frustrated with FEMA that this is also, they stated that this happened with Florence and Pamlico County. So just the geographic area of eastern North Carolina, especially the Outer Banks, may not get the eye wall, but we get the outer brushes. And so several hurricanes move through, create damage on the Outer Banks. And unfortunately, with FEMA rejecting the assistance, not only with Hurricane Florence a few years back, but also with Dorian, leadership is going to be getting together over the next few days, and hopefully get a bill ready to send to the officials in North Carolina to get some help has started out for eastern North Carolina. Speaking of help, Food Line and Red Cross and the Food Line customers were able to get together, and through that they were able to accumulate $172,489.30 that was raised in stores from customers and from employees with Food Line, and they've partnered up with American Red Cross, and all these this money will be sent for Hurricane Dorian relief efforts on the coastal part of North Carolina. And also, you may have heard throughout the last day or two, Mr. Jerry Wood, a resident here in North Carolina, won $100,000 in the lottery. After taxes, he was able to gather $70,756, and he has pledged to use some of that money to also help those folks on Ocracoke Island who are affected by Hurricane Dorian. So Dorian continues to make news here in North Carolina, and I'll open it up to you guys if you want to discuss maybe a little bit. If not, that's okay too. But unfortunately, with the path fortunately, the path that took Dorian just off the coast of South Carolina and just skirted the Outer Banks, it did cause damage, but unfortunately not enough for FEMA to declare assistance in the state of North Carolina. And this is some heartbreaking news for those folks who were affected, especially on Ocracoke Island. We were able to see some of the flooding that took place there. So our thoughts and prayers continue for those folks who are affected by this, and hopefully with the appeal process, if that happens, maybe FEMA will be able to find some money to help out those folks in North Carolina. So with that, the tropics still a conversation, although we don't have any storms threatening the United States. We do have a few areas of observation out there that we're watching. And Shay, I'll bring you in on that. October is still in the heat of in kind of the last month that we see a real big peak in the hurricane season. Everything's starting to go downhill, but in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen October remain active. So I know you are watching a few areas out in the Atlantic right now.
Yeah, Scotty, thanks a lot. Yeah, talking about tropics, things are relatively quiet overall. We still have a lot of warm water out there. The Gulf of Mexico is still very warm. Portions of the Atlantic Basin and pockets where warm water exists. There's a lot of upper shear out there. There isn't a lot of activity, really, any significant tropical waves that we're watching. There are a few areas off the East Coast that are being watched right now, but there's a lot of upper shear on that. There's cold front sort of associated with it. And then I think we may have something lingering off the New England to mid-Atlantic coastline over the next few days. I don't think it's going to make landfall, maybe subtropical in nature at best, but it's a very low chance for that. Let me go ahead and share screen to sort of talk a little bit about. I'm going to try this again. Last time it locked me in on it. So let me know when you can see the screen.
We've got it.
Okay. And are you seeing the peak hurricane season graphic?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. So I know where to stop share is on the other monitor. That's weird. Okay. Anyways, so yeah, we look at this time of the year. We had September 10th is about the peak of the hurricane season. We've since passed that. We've gotten all the way down here where you see this next little spike coming up about the middle of October. We're very close to that. So we're still in this little hook right here of this activity, flurry of activity for October. We tend to see powerful hurricanes this time of the year. Right now we have nothing, but Lorenzo was quite a formidable hurricane on many aspects. I mean, that was the easternmost Category 5 hurricane to ever form. And it was pretty far over in the Eastern Atlantic Basin. One thing that came out of that was not only was the rapid intensification very high, but it also, it basically cool water upwelling underneath the storm is what finally did it in. And it was problematic all the way over to Ireland and even into portions of England. They kept the name Lorenzo. Normally they might repurpose that storm for the European windstorm events and give it a name. But since it came from the NHC already named, they just kept it. But it was pretty problematic for them. One thing to remember about was the Bourbon Road boat, the French boat that got, I think it was one engine down. There was some mechanical issues going on with it. It got caught in that hurricane. 14 crew members went down. 3 were rescued. The other 11 remained missing. So at least we had some folks rescued from that operation. I know the NOAA hurricane hunters went in, Air Force hurricane hunters went in, and they were doing tracks. And all the efforts did produce 3 survivors from that. So hats off to them for the efforts for finding those crew members of the Bourbon Road. Prayers out to the families of the others. We go on to the National Hurricane Center map. Let me zoom this down a little bit. And 7:33 p.m. tonight, latest update, we have 3 little areas. These are very low, 10%. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of upper shear. There's a cold front with upper shear across the top. We have surface winds diving down from the north. So a lot of the convection is getting ripped off to the northeast of the storm. This area out here had a higher chance earlier. Now it's come down. This is over a cooler body of water at this point. Look at COD satellite. This is the area right here. that is off of the North Carolina coast, and you can see all the convective activity blown off to the northeast of the storm. The center is somewhere in this area, but you can see this upper flow really cutting across. And if you look closely down in between these clouds up here, you can see this surface flow heading from north to south. So really a crisscross of winds that really just rips storms apart. So not much to really talk about in the tropics right now, and we anticipate that to continue for the next 5 to 7 days. It doesn't look like there's really anything of significance coming. We'll have to continue to watch areas such as the Eastern Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, especially with the loop current off the north tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. Very warm waters in these areas. These have the highest potential for tropical cyclone development. So we'll continue to watch that. And back to you, Scotty.
All right, thank you for that, Shay. And it's good to see that we don't have anything major developing in October. I know for you guys in South Carolina, y'all had your run at October storms with Matthew, and we had Michael last year, and just the 2015 flood event. So it's good to see so far October remaining fairly quiet for us. So.
If we get another name, we're on M, so the next name will be Melissa.
Yeah, so we'll be watching that. Hopefully we won't have Melissa. Hopefully we can put it into the tropics pretty soon. So with that, speaking of the tropics, NOAA was able to issue a preliminary map. Now this will change. We still have a few more months left. Peter, you're looking at some of the most expensive disasters we've had this year with this new map that's come out.
Yeah, this is pretty crazy. Looking at this map here, there were plenty of disasters this year, weather related. And as of this year, as of yesterday, there have been 10 weather and climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion across the United States. So as you can see on the map, I mean, it's pretty much everybody along the parts of the mid-Atlantic into the center part of the United States down to the southeast towards the Gulf. So in this article, it says this includes 3 flooding events, 5 severe storm events, and 2 tropical cyclone events. And overall, these events resulted in the deaths of 39 people and had significant economic effects on the areas impacted. And also, between 1980 and 2018, the annual average is 6.3 events, and the annual average for the most recent 5 years is 12.6 events. So pretty crazy stuff, pretty crazy numbers. And a little farther down the article, it says 2019 is the 5th consecutive year in which 10 or more billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events have impacted the United States. Pretty crazy stuff. So this is a great article. We should probably post this on Twitter so everyone can read it. And it's pretty interesting to see this map and also the charts they have throughout the article.
Yeah, definitely so, Peter. And that's some crazy stats to see how much of an uptick we've seen over I think you said the past 5 or 10 years. We've seen almost, it looks like it's doubled in this. Evan, I was reading this article a little earlier, and it highlighted the severe weather outbreak that took place in the plains, and we kind of caught the tail end of that with the last 3 or 4 days of tornadoes out in the Midwest. But that was one of the events that was highlighted in this article. And you and we were able to see a tornado in Tipton, Kansas, and thankfully it was out in a rural area, but we just seen the devastation that these tornadoes can bring.
Oh yeah, definitely. Down more towards Oklahoma, where they had upwards of, I think, 20 some odd tornadoes in just that few day span right before we got out there in late May. It's unreal the kind of damage that it did to some of the homes and farms. And like Scotty said, we got lucky in the tornado that we saw only hit a wheat field and just barely clipped a barn. But that's heartbreaking to know that more than $1 billion was lost in these events.
It really is. And Shay, it showed 2 tropical systems, obviously Dorian being one, but the other one, Milda, I think I'm pronouncing it right, created a lot of flooding down again in the Houston, Texas area. And it just seems like, Shay, when we see these tropical systems affecting the United States, the wind's a thing, but we're seeing a lot more flooding events from these.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, that's an area, that's a pocket of the Gulf of Mexico, the northwestern coastline, where storms tend to slow down. There isn't a lot of lift in that area. Imelda did basically what Harvey did. It went into land. I mean, it's a good thing it didn't have another 24 to 48 hours over water, or it could have been a real disaster. It was a disaster on many levels because of the flooding. I mean, I think some areas got up to almost 3 feet of rain. Harvey dumped up to 5 feet. So you're talking about a tropical storm capable of dumping that much rain just because it slows down and has nowhere to go. We look at Harvey and we thought of, the brown ocean effect, where sometimes the ground gets so saturated that it just continues to feed the storm, and it continues to feed the convection around it with the heat and the warmth. But this one, it was just tropical moisture just feeding up out of the Gulf of Mexico, and that's a bad area. If it goes a little further to the east by just a few hundred miles, at least it can get kind of lifted up out of that area. Maybe a slow jog, but there's a little bit more movement as cold fronts tend to reach down to the Gulf to tap into that moisture and pull things along. But right there on that northwestern coast, that's a bad spot. It banks up against some higher terrain and it just sits. So, but we had Dorian, luckily, grazed the coastline in the southeast and then quickly raced off to the northeast. So it didn't stick around for very long. Unfortunately, there was a lot of flooding. I'm really surprised about that with FEMA. And we'll have to, continue to monitor that as to why and what their appeals process is going to be. But we're talking about $1 billion costly storm there, it made the list. So it's kind of interesting to see that they didn't make the cut. And there's a lot of criteria behind that. But yeah, 2 storms. This is becoming almost every year. We went for almost 12 years without a major system making landfall. Last year, of course, Michael. But it just proves that even something as weak as Imelda can create a lot of havoc, even as a tropical storm. So we got to, there's a lot of talk about possibly, doing the Saffir-Simpson scale, sort of tuning that in based on flooding, right? There's a lot of talk about that. I don't know where the NHC is with it, or if anybody's on, how many people are on board with it. But reclassification of storms based on rainfall amounts, I think, is a real thing to start looking at as we see this trend continue.
Yeah, I agree with you, Shay. I know that's a hotly debated topic right now in the weather community. The scale that we see hurricanes, and primarily right now they're judged off of wind speed, but we really need to start incorporating the rainfall and the storm surge and things like that, because besides Hurricane Michael, which did produce catastrophic winds, a lot of these events are happening because of the flooding and the storm surge threat. So hopefully with this making the $1 billion map, hopefully that'll kind of help North Carolina officials have a little bit of power in the try to turn over the appeal that there's no assistance right now for Dorian. Speaking of those $1 billion disasters, we still have a few months left. And the next topic we're going to talk about could feed into to one of these events happening. Actually, 2, we're going to be talking about the drought here in the Carolinas and also the wildfire threat out in California. And both of those could add on to that map by the end of this year. I'll start first with North Carolina, and then I'll let Shay kind of go over what's going on in South Carolina. But this is the drought and monitor. This was updated last Thursday. So we'll see another one of these come in tomorrow. We'll be able to post that information up on our social media platforms, Twitter and Facebook, tomorrow with the updated drought index. So right now we're working off the information that was released last Thursday at 8 a.m. And for North Carolina, it's showing there's 4 different stages of drought. Actually 5. We have D0, which is abnormally dry. Then D1 is moderate drought, D2 is severe drought, D3 is extreme drought, and D4 is exceptional drought. So you can kind of see the scales there. Right now, 62.3% of North Carolina is under some sort of drought index, with 41% being in the moderate to severe drought. And then 4% is almost in the exceptional drought. So for North Carolina. So again, over 62.3% of North Carolina right now experiencing drought conditions. I will say yesterday there were some locations that was able to get a little rainfall, especially in the mountains. There were a few locations that received over an inch of rain, but in the grand scheme of things, the rainfall that we saw yesterday really didn't put much of a dent in this. In fact, when we see the drought monitor released tomorrow, we may not see much change in some of those locations in the mountains, but I do expect to see the drought at least extended further into eastern North Carolina, as well as the Piedmont of North Carolina as well. So that is something we'll watch. But these drought conditions look to continue at least for the next week or so. Evan's going to give us a weather update in just a little bit, where we could see maybe some rainfall moving into the area. But for North Carolina, a majority of North Carolina under some sort of drought, and it looks to continue the dry conditions at least through the weekend. Hopefully, by next week, we can start to get some of these fronts to really drop into the area and produce some rainfall. So, Shay, that's the situation in North Carolina. 62.3% of the state under some sort of drought condition. We do have the severe drought to extreme drought, about 5% in that category. So not a lot. Most of those are in the southwestern part of North Carolina. So that's the story here in North Carolina. What's it look like in South Carolina?
Yeah, Scotty, if you can keep that map up, Tim, if you would, I definitely want to share one screen for South Carolina in a second. But if you look at that, the white on that map, right, that's where there's no drought. That's the path that Dorian took. So you see a swipe of the coastline with rains, and that sort of helped alleviate the drought situation along the immediate coastline for much of the southeast region. But that area is slowly starting to fill in with the yellows, and eventually that'll go towards the coastline unless we get some rainfall over the next week or two. The drought monitor, I believe they end their final readings Wednesday night, I believe it is, and then they go through Tuesday AM. There's a timeline for it, so whatever rainfall is picked up within that timeline gets registered, but if it falls the next day, it doesn't. So we'll see. I think we have maybe something late weekend coming up, and I'll go ahead and share my screen for South Carolina and get a better idea of it. And you can see some of these areas in the Midlands, they're suffering the worst. They're in D3 extreme drought. The oranges are severe drought, which go on to the upstate and portions down near Aiken, Georgia, along the border here with Georgia. And then as we get to the coastline, things are starting to fill in from south to north as we go into time, though. And that's mainly because of the little amount of rainfall we've gotten. And in fact, if we look at the next 5 days, this is the Schreff plume viewer, which shows the amount of rainfall we're expecting in the Charleston area. And there's zilch all the way until maybe Sunday morning. We start to pick up some rain. And this one up here is only 1/10 of an inch. It looks high on the graph, but it's really a very small amount of rainfall. So we'll see if that improves at all. But we're not expecting this next cold front to drop a lot of rain. What happens is you get this time of the year, cold fronts sweep across the country. You get these upper lows over the Great Lakes. It draws a lot of cool air down, drier air down behind these cold fronts, and then it doesn't really get a good connection with the Gulf of Mexico for very long and dries out. So what happens with here is what's called frontalysis, where fronts come to die. So, and then we get them, they come through the region, they may stall and then sweep offshore. They're really just carrying a lot of drier air with it. So that's sort of what happens this time of the year. But I try to tell folks, usually in October, we see some big rain event, at least along the coastline, even if it's a nor'easter event or a low pressure along the coast, something of that nature. We usually see something this time of the year. As far as the Midlands and upstate, we're just going to have to count on cold fronts to bring that rain to those areas. And, it wasn't too long ago, just a few years ago, we had some serious wildfires going on in North Carolina mountains. In fact, it got to where our air quality was very poor here in the Charleston area. The smoke was coming down slope on northwest flow, and it got caught up in the sea breeze. So the sea breeze was just circulating the smoke. You could actually see it go offshore and circulate back into the coastline during a sea breeze. It's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. So hopefully we won't have that situation setting up again this year.
Yeah, I can attest to those wildfires. That's one of our concerns. And in fact, James let us know earlier there was a brush fire in Statesville near the interchange of Interstate 40 and 77. And we're going to continue to see the opportunities for those brush fires and as these dry conditions continue. I was able to look up a stat, and it showed anywhere between 3 to as much as 9 to 12 inches of rain we would have to have before we erase the drought status in both Carolinas. So it looks like we're going to be in this for the long haul, at least through this fall. It looks to continue to be dry. Evan, you're monitoring the upcoming weather. Like you said earlier, we were able to kind of kick the 90s out. We'll probably be done with the 90s for the rest of the year. But it looks like we do have another front trying to move into the area over the weekend, and maybe could spawn a little bit of rain in portions of the Carolinas.
Yeah, so, as Shay was just saying a minute ago, unfortunately, this front is going to be moving through on Saturday evening, through the weekend for the rest of the Carolinas. It looks to be mostly dry. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you guys see this? I'm going to roll with yes.
Yes, we got you.
Okay,
Yes.
so if we look at this for right now, month to date, we're only at October 9th, but some locations, particularly mountain locations, have already seen almost an inch of rain. Asheville has seen 0.67 inches so far, which is only about 2/10 of an inch less than they saw in the entire month of September. So that's been a huge, huge help to the drought problem. Now, as Scotty said, that may not necessarily make it massive dent in the drought monitor, but it is at least a good step in the right direction. Now, as for other stations outside of Western North Carolina, GSP is leading the race with 0.07 inches of rain. So it's been incredibly dry. There's been no real systems that have moved through. I think downtown Charleston saw about half an inch yesterday. But besides that, nowhere else has seen any significant amount of rain. And even if we look at the past 30 days, the 30-day precipitation anomaly is anywhere from about 1 inch to upwards of 5 to 6 inches below average. So what we typically would have expected in September, these areas saw very little of that. Now, obviously, we need the rain to settle off some of these drought problems. And if we look at the Euro ensemble, it looks a little bit promising, at least through 7 days. I'm only going to take this through 7 days for now. It shows definitely some substantial precipitation in southwestern North Carolina and perhaps a streak of precipitation across the middle of the state, which kind of tells me that perhaps there could be something moving up and perhaps along the coast. I don't know. We'll see. I think before the next coastal storm that could tap into the Gulf moisture won't be until near the end of that 7-day range, if not later. But unfortunately, the GFS ensemble is not quite as excited about the precip odds through 7 days. They're generally half an inch below what we would typically see. So that means very little rain. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to get any rain, but the GEFS is definitely trending drier than the Euro. And with the system that's coming through Saturday night, that's not going to be enough to drop anything worthwhile besides a few showers in Western North Carolina. Now, the WPC, they've issued their forecast for the next 7 days, and it's encouraging for some areas. It really kind of looks a lot like the Euro ensemble, where upwards of 3/4 to even an inch of rain in southwestern North Carolina, and up to half an inch of rain across maybe northwestern South Carolina and through the Piedmont, and out towards Norfolk, almost in Virginia, and the Raleigh area. They could see up to half an inch of rain. So that's promising. It's more promising than things were looking about a week ago, but we still have a long ways to go. If you look at the first 25, first 25 members of the Euro ensemble. So now remember, the Euro ensemble is made up of 50 members total. So this is just the first half of them. But if we're looking out through 10 days, you kind of got to squint a little bit. These are small pictures, but there's a few members like this one over here, number 23, that don't show much precipitation. But overall, we're definitely seeing more of this red, and that red equates to anywhere from 2 to 5 inches of rain. We're seeing a lot of these members with these red streaks across the Carolinas. You can see it in 18 and 22 and 11. So that's really telling me that at some point over the next 10 days, it's looking a little bit more likely that we're going to see some type of coastal storm, kind of similar to what Shay was mentioning, that's going to finally dump that rainfall that we've been hoping for and waiting for so long. Toss it back to you, Scotty.
Thank you for that, Evan. Yeah, we all need some rain. And speaking of rain and the lack of, there's some wildfire concerns. We've been talking about that here in the Carolinas, where fortunately we've not seen any major fires. But as we continue to remain dry, the chances of that go up. But out in California, something we are monitoring are the chances of increased fire danger, critical fire danger in some locations. So we want to talk a little bit about that. I want to screen share something before I toss it over to Shay. 1 second, Shay. Let me get this website. I thought I had it pulled up, but we've been talking about the fire threat internally here and something that California is doing. But first, I want to share the National Weather Service out of Sacramento, California, has issued a red flag warning for today and tomorrow. And all these locations are under the red flag warning. This includes places close to San Francisco and down into San Jose, Modesto, California, up into Santa Rosa, Stockton, California. So some fairly populated areas, even up into Redding. So this means extreme fire danger, rapid fire spread with any new fire starts, winds north to northeast, 20 to 30 mile per hour sustained, with gusts to 40 to 50. And locally, we could see higher, or they could see higher gusts. And then very low daytime humidity and really not a lot of humidity. We normally see humidity rise at night, but that's not the case here, with only a 20 to 35% chance, or 25% humidity in these areas. So Shay, that's something we're monitoring. I know you do a lot of wind forecasting, so something that the folks who are watching tonight may have heard of, you may have not heard of, but the Santa Ana winds really drive these extreme fire dangers in California.
No, that's exactly right, Scotty. This is the time of the year when Santa Ana winds really start to crank up. What happens is you have a climatic shift of what's called the North Pacific High. Also, you have the polar jet stream that starts to dip down across the country this time of the year, which brings all the cool weather from west to east. The combination of the North Pacific High, as it starts to drop south down the California coast, it usually sits up just off the northwest coast through the summertime, through the warmer time of the year, the warmer months. And then as the cooler months come around, that high is forced southwards towards Southern California and even just off of Baja. And so that's where it sits primarily through the winter. But during that transition, you get a lot of large domes of high pressure built into the Great Basin area. And what that does is it pretty much forces offshore winds through the California Valley along the coastline. Let me go ahead and share screen, and I'm going to give you a little bit, try not to geek out too much on this. But what's set up right now, why the alert is so high, is because of this 1,038 millibar. This is a rather strong area of high pressure over the Great Basin. Remember, this is clockwise flow around it. It's pinched in between what's called a Rossby wave, or dip in the jet stream. So these winds are going to be forced down through all the way to the Northern California coastline. And that's what the threat is up in the mountains, especially, and downslope to the coast. These winds are really going to pick up some speed. And that, as it goes forward, you see this high just sitting there. And that's pretty much what's driving it. It looks like it's going to be about a 24 to 48 hour period. Sometimes these Santa Anas can go on for days. One thing here to consider, this is the current jet stream. This is the polar jet dipping down. And when you have high pressure built in between both legs of this is called a Rossby wave, where it bows down across the country, or we call it dip in the jet stream. This is what's forcing the wind down from the north at the higher levels. High pressure is forcing air to the surface, where the coastline has lower pressure. So the pressure gradient built between the high and the low along the coastline is what drives these winds higher speeds. Now, 25 to 30 is significant, but it actually could be more like 40 in some spots. I've seen some of the forecasts, and these winds can actually get up to 70 to 100 miles per hour when they come down slope. So if we go forward in time, we see that jet stream dip. It starts to move across the country. We're going to see some cooler air coming with it, along with the cold front ahead. And then we have another area of high pressure building in behind that. So that's another concern. I did pull up the Weather Channel. I have a decent little graphic here of some of the windiest locations in typical Santa Ana winds. Now, this isn't limited to Los Angeles or Southern California. In San Francisco Bay Area, they do call these El Diablo or Diablo winds because that's about where they're going to be occurring this time of the year. And as the North Pacific High starts to drop, we see these Santa Ana winds really kicking up further south across Mojave. Nighttime, with the relative humidity dropping, you get a higher pressure gradient at night as the desert cools, and then this air has to rush out of that area. It's a warmer wind, and so it really pumps out of the Santa Clara River Valley towards the coast. These are offshore northeasterly winds, and also through the Santa Ana Canyon, which is named for the Santa Ana winds, through the Cajon Pass and Banning Pass. And you can see the downslope on the terrain. I like the Weather Channel's graphic here. It really shows it in more of a three-dimensional view, where you can kind of get a better idea of how these winds work. And so that's what really drives it. I mean, it causes a lot of damage. It's a very dry wind. It happens during sunny skies for the most part. And these are the winds that drive wildfires to epic proportions. And that's the concern that they have right now as we start to get into the Santa Ana season. When these high pressures built up to the north in those in the Great Basin, that's the trigger for the alerts. And did I see that they've cut power to how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people?
Yeah, Shay, you have. This is called the, let me get the correct term for it. I don't want to misspeak. It is the public safety power shutoff. And basically what is happening is a lot of these power companies, especially in Northern California, they're cutting the power off to folks. This is a process. They monitor the weather conditions and forecasts. A couple of days ago, they sent out advance warning to folks. The fire conditions look to be pretty high for Wednesday and Thursday. So they told folks a few days in advance, hey, we're going to be cutting the power off to your location. Right now, over 800,000 folks without power in Northern California. And the reason they're doing this is if the companies shut power off when we do see these gusty winds, and we know in gusty winds we likely could see trees and power lines come down, and when a power line comes down, it can spark new fires, especially with the extreme and critical fire conditions out there. So they have cut the power off, so that way if their power lines do go down, they won't spark any additional fires that could take place. So this at least is going to go through Thursday, and then if wildfires do pick up during this time, obviously they'll have to go out and monitor those conditions and check on the power grid before they're able to turn the power or reconnect the power back on. So there are some shelters opening for some of these, but the power officials in California Emergency Management told people you need to prepare. We as meteorologists keep telling folks you need to prepare for these storms, hurricanes, winter storms, even forest fires. You need to have that safety plan, know where you would go, have that emergency kit ready, and just stock up on your stuff if you do need to leave your home. So it is something that's really fascinating to me. I learned about this last night, and we've been chatting back and forth, and it's actually gained a lot of national attention today. The Washington Post, USA Today, a lot of the major news outlets have been covering this event. So folks are obviously they're upset because it's a sunny day and there's no power. Businesses are closed, schools are closed. But then the power officials are like, well, if we keep the power off, that cuts the risk of wildfires. If any of our equipment is affected by the wind, it won't spark any additional fires. So big debate going on. I even think the governor of California is not a fan of this. He came out and said it's a problem. People are concerned. So it's something that is really being discussed in California. And I feel like as this dry season continues out in California and the wildfire season continues, we may hear more and more of this. Shay, so you've got some live data that's pulled up right now of the winds right now in the San Francisco area.
Yep, I'm just looking around, and a lot of times this kind of wind it's missed by even some of the best modeling. You can see the trend is upwards to 20 from the east, northeast, or northeast when we get up to Saddleback. This is one of the areas where these winds start to generate. Now, the models may not pick up the speed. You can see the gust here already approaching 30 knots up here as of, about our time in California right now. So these averages may pan out, but sometimes these averages can go up even 10 to 20 miles an hour or 10 to 20 knots above what forecast values, even with the higher resolution models. So we're already seeing that northeast flow start to make its way through the area. Right now, we have sort of a prefrontal, flow here. We had some southwest or southwest winds earlier. Now it's starting to shift, and you're seeing that southwest flow starting to work its way down. So this is where it starts to originate, right? These higher levels in the Sierra Nevadas, where the high pressure is, the stronger the high pressure working down in the area, the more air is forced down slope. And that's on the western side of the mountains towards the ocean. And wherever it can get in between, anywhere where there's a break, like a valley or a canyon, that's where the wind is going to really focus on. So San Francisco, as you zoom into San Francisco, you can see there's, I was just up in this area, actually up in the Sierra Nevadas, but it really rushes down through this area. So these are the El Diablo winds occurring there right now. And as we get a little further into the season, when the highs start to sink further south, we'll see that start to populate all the way down to LA and in the Santa Clara Valley, and then all the way down into San Diego. This is a particularly bad spot between LA and San Diego, where a lot of these fires really break out from the stronger Santa Ana winds. So just some live data there showing you the trend that things are already starting to increase. So that's where, any spark or fire that gets out of hand, it can erupt very quickly.
Yeah, hopefully those will be very minimal. That's a dangerous thing. We remember here locally in the Carolinas, you probably remember the Gatlinburg fire and seeing some of the crazy videos and pictures coming out of that area. So the power companies trying to do their best to at least help eliminate one cause of fire concerns there. So speaking of the forest fires, we want to transition to an interview we did earlier this year with meteorologist Todd Lindley from the National Weather Service in Norman, Oklahoma. He's going to talk to us about how difficult it is to forecast these wildfires and how the winds play a major role in them. Todd, I have a question for you. For getting the word out, as you guys are in the Norman office for your forecasting, I know the Storm Prediction Center, which is your neighbors there at the National Weather Center, they issue fire weather outlooks, I think a day 1, day 2, and then day 3 through 8, I believe is what it is. And then you guys also issue like red flag warnings and stuff like that. Can you kind of talk to our viewers about those different products, and if one's issued for their area, maybe what that those advisories or whatever may mean for them?
Sure. Yes. Well, you're correct. The Storm Prediction Center issues fire weather outlooks for days 3 through 8. Day 2 and of course day 1 as well. That basically just indicate whether the fire weather will be elevated, critical, or extremely critical for a given area, and that's a good indicator to folks if they're interested in such things and they want to know just how critical the fire weather conditions are on any given day in the outlook period. At the WFO, at the National Weather Service offices, we issue fire weather watches, generally about can be as far out as 3 days in advance of a potential event, and those just indicate that conditions are becoming increasingly favorable for extreme fire behavior, or also new wildland fire ignitions. And then once we get within about 24 hours in an event, we will generally, if the forecast remains on track, we'll upgrade to a red flag warning. And a red flag warning is kind of a unique beast in the National Weather Service. Everything else is tornado warning, winter storm warning, flash flood warning, and then we call this a red flag warning. And it has a unique history. It was basically a firefighter safety message, is how it originated out in the West, where many times in the fire season in the Western U.S. you have fire always on the ground out there, and it was a message used to communicate to firefighters that at this particular time and space the fire will likely behave in an extreme way, and it's a safety message for you to take precautions. Certainly here on the Southern Plains, now the red flag warning has morphed more into a public safety and, of course, a land management and fire management product as well. So the National Weather Service is looking at that in the future, trying to determine, is there a need for public fire safety messages, and what venue would we use to communicate that. So that's an ongoing effort to maybe modernize the fire weather program. Now, sometimes when we get into these very active extreme fire situations, we have what's called a fire warning. And a fire warning is a warning that we can issue at the National Weather Service at the request of a local emergency manager that needs to communicate, prompt a mass communication of evacuation instructions. So say a wildfire is approaching a town or a community, the emergency manager can ask us to disseminate a fire warning with detailed instructions for how folks should evacuate.
I have a question about that because I'm in emergency management. So how often is that utilized? Because I know we have our own evacuation warning systems and our own ways to do all of that. How often do they rely on that?
It differs depending on the season and the severity of the fires that we see in any given year. I know that event that I showed you images of from Amarillo, I believe they issued 2 fire warnings during that event. I've also noticed that use of that product is not very consistent around the country. Some areas where they have, I don't know if it's relationships with the emergency managers or just cultural knowledge of that capability. Sometimes you see those issued in some parts of the country, and in others you don't. It does seem that here in the Southern Plains, it seems to be used more commonly.
And Todd, Ashley, I'm going to piggyback kind of Ashley's question. When you do have these events going on, what is the role of the National Weather Service? I know you guys do decision support. Are you there communicating with them? Do you give them updates? What is the role for the Weather Service when we do have these big fires?
Wow, that's a really great question. So there are several parts to that. I would say historically, the role of the National Weather Service in fire has been strategic. Our role has been to identify periods or days that are going to have extreme fire behavior due to weather, combinations of weather and fuels, and issue red flag warnings. And then those really prompted strategic preparations by fire and land management, and maybe they would allocate resources to a certain area for a given period of time so that they're available to assist and help mitigate public impacts. But now, especially with GO16, our role is really transitioning from not just strategic role but to a tactical role. So now our red flag warnings and fire weather watches and outlooks can help strategically pre-locate resources to a area of heightened risk, but now we're actually starting to tactically assist in routing those pre-deployed resources to the fire early so that they can attack it early and heavy and really have a mitigating impact on some of these violent fire events.
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to say staging is really important. I know you were saying that NWS played a role in that previously, but we actually sent a crew down to Childress for 2 weeks a couple weeks ago when they had the Amarillo fires, because we were seeing that, and they have the mutual aid program
that's right, TIFMAS.
Yep, TIFMAS.
Yeah.
So we sent 2 crews down there, and they were able to help that too. So
I can say beyond our fire weather watches and red flag warnings, the National Weather Service plays a big role in communicating with the state forestry agencies, certainly in Oklahoma and in Texas, and helping to target those TIFMAS deployments that you're talking about, Ashley. So we actually are providing experimental significant wildland fire outlooks that are probabilistic in nature, and may say that there is a 40% probability of significant wildland fires in the Amarillo area, on 3 days from now or whatever. And some of that information is helping to guide some of these strategic preparations that you're seeing from the state of Texas.
Yeah, and then I had one more question for you. So as an emergency manager who is currently working for a fire department who has meteorology, forecasting background and schooling and everything, they want me to get really good at this because they're very excited about having that kind of resource. So what are some resources or any kind of thing I could tune into to enhance that? Because I will say, living in Lubbock and being a college student who loves severe weather, I really just paid attention to tornado forecasting. So I could probably use some work on my fire weather forecasting. So what are some good resources for that?
Well, you're not alone. Most meteorologists in the Southern Plains have always been very heavily interested in severe convection and storms and tornadoes and the fire side of things. There was not a lot of work done on plains fire meteorology prior to the onset of these big events in about 2005, 06 and beyond. So, but since then we've made tremendous strides, and there are a couple of resources out there. There are a couple of papers that there's a small working group of subject matter experts in this area in the plains, and we have authored a number of papers, one in the electronic journal Severe Storms Meteorology on Southern Great Plains wildfire outbreaks, for instance. So you can look at that paper and kind of get the basic understanding of identifying these outbreak type patterns. We also have a relatively newer paper in the NWA Journal of Operational Meteorology on the low-level thermal ridge and how to use that to really focus in on an area of heightened risk and physically what's going on with the low level thermal ridge, it makes it such a bad player for fire.
Well, perfect. Thanks for that. I look forward to looking into that.
Todd, I had a question for you, if you can hear me okay.
I sure can. Go ahead.
That's good news. Looks like it's not capturing me when I talk on the stream, so I might have to have everybody repeat what I'm saying. Oh man, it's been one of those nights. It's been one of those days. But let's talk Go 16 again briefly, and so with Go 16 you have a multitude of fire products. You not only have the firepower, fire area, fire temperature derived products from the level 2 stream, but you also have the fire temperature RGB. What products are y'all finding that you're using most in operations?
Okay, well, the one particular channel that's specifically made for fire really is channel 7, the 3.9 micron. It's a shortwave IR channel, and that is probably the default tool that we're using with Go 16. There are, like you said, the fire temperature RGB, which is really cool. That's the example I was showing in the animation. Looks really, really ominous when you see a good fire on there. A lot of the derived products like firepower, fire size, those algorithms, from my understanding, are still being kind of tweaked and calibrated to Go 16 because they were actually designed for legacy Goes. So they're still a work in progress. And from looking at fire activity in the West this past summer, they still need some tweaking, and they're being tweaked. One thing our forecasters have had a lot of success in finding fire very early is looking at what's known as the fog difference channel, which is basically the 11 minus 3.9 micron difference. And with that particular channel, it seems to be very sensitive, and you can see fires really early while they're still fairly small. In fact, in the last year, on 3 separate occasions here at WFO Norman, we've successfully helped dispatch crews to structure fires that were previously unreported.
Oh, that's awesome. You guys have any luck with the nighttime microphysics too?
I have not looked at that in close detail for fire, so I would have to withhold judgment on that one.
Awesome.
And I have one more for you, Todd. If I am a viewer watching this show, if I live in that area and there's a major wildfire ongoing, what's the best way that I can get plugged into what's going on? You know, a lot of folks, they're on their phones. They're not really watching TV necessarily. They're just kind of living out of their phones. When you issue your warnings or your products, do they automatically go out to the phones, or do people need to go into their phones and activate that? What's the process that people can know what's going on without being told through the news at the last minute or see smoke in the air?
Yeah, I would say local media and listening to your local officials is still the best means of communication to get real-time fire information. During these fire events, both Texas A&M Forest Service and the Oklahoma Forestry Services are very active in social media, especially on Twitter and Facebook. You can get updates that way, but definitely the local, broadcast media or media online via social media is definitely the best way to get the most up-to-date information. And of course, if it turns into an emergency type of event and your home or your community is being threatened, just listen to the local emergency management and law enforcement officials.
And Todd, my last question for you is, we've got Go 16 now going. What do you think the future is for forecasting these wildfires? Do you see anything else down the pipeline, or anything you guys are kind of working on to get the forecast better and to kind of really hone in on this?
Well, it's an exciting time to be working on wildland fire, not just here in the plains, but all across the country, really, because there are some exciting things. You've got the new generation of Go satellites, 16 and 17, which has now been launched. So that's really going to revolutionize the way we handle fire, no doubt. There are other things too from a broader picture forecast perspective. Some exciting things that are being done at the Fire Sciences Lab in Missoula. Gentleman up there, Matt Jolly, scientist there, that's been working on something called the Wildland Fire Assessment System. It's a gridded kind of fire danger system that forecasters will be able to access and utilize. to help forecast areas of heightened risk as well. So there are some innovative things occurring, in the wildland fire communities, specifically in the areas of operational fire forecasting for the National Weather Service and beyond.
Okay, I lied. I do have one more.
Okay.
You just brought up a good point. Can you see these fires before they're actually reported? And can you be the ones to actually report to the authorities what's going on at what time?
In some cases, we absolutely can and have been on multiple occasions. Like I said, even recently picking up on structure fires, and that's pretty amazing when you're talking about an instrument that's 22,000 miles away and it's seeing a house burning in central Oklahoma. But we are, in many cases, catching a signature in the shortwave IR imagery before local 911 calls are received at a local jurisdiction.
And Todd, speaking on that, I know we talked before this show. You guys have partnered with the Oklahoma Emergency Management. You guys are doing some cool things with those folks as well, with wildfires and with the GO16 data.
That's right. Some of the folks there, Zach Stanford and Daniel Piltz, have been instrumental in helping us with this wildfire detection, or what we call hotspot notification system that we're using here. And it's, direct feedback during periods of active fires here in Oklahoma and in Texas, and even now expanding into Kansas. The direct feedback we're getting from the EMs is certainly along the lines of, this is saving lives and saving property.
Very cool. Well, I know we don't want to keep you all night. I know we could continue talking about this, but how can our folks get a hold of you or kind of see, do you have a Twitter account you want to push out, or just the forecast office there? What social media accounts can they follow you
just at NWS Norman, and my email address is todd.lindley@noaa.gov.
We're back next week with an all-new episode of the Carolina Weather Group, Wednesday night, 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time on Facebook Live, YouTube, and Periscope, and always available on demand as a podcast on your favorite podcast platforms, including TuneIn, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play.